Hello everybody, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be going over Unit 1, Lesson 5 on limits to growth for populations. We're going to have 4 learning objectives today. Those are going to be to identify the factors that affect carrying capacity within an environment for a given population. So what are the factors that contribute to that? We're going to identify the limiting factors that do depend on a population's density and the limiting factors that do not depend on a population's density. And since that is such a major part of this conversation, if you need to go back and review what we mean specifically by population density, please take the time before moving forward to do that. Because that will really help your understanding in this lesson. And then finally, the last objective would be to explain the relationship between those limiting factors and the likelihood of a population's extinction. We've got 3 vocabulary terms. Those are limiting factor, density-dependent limiting factor, and density-independent limiting factor. So we're using this word a lot. What is a limiting factor? A limiting factor is ultimately going to determine the carrying capacity of an environment for a species. So within an environment, there are going to be a variety of environmental factors, and these factors, a good example might be resource availability. These factors are going to contribute to the limit that that environment will place on certain populations. So limiting factors are going to contribute to how many of each population for each species can survive within a given environment. And there are 2 types of limiting factors that we're going to go in detail for today. Those are going to be those that are density dependent and density independent. So density dependent limiting factors are, again, said in different words. These are going to be the factors that place limitations on populations, and they will have a larger effect when a population is more dense within an area. So if we increase how many of a certain population exist within an environment, then these factors are going to have a larger effect on those populations. So as density increases, so does the effect of our density-dependent limiting factors. Some examples that we're going to go into more detail for today will include competition, parasitism and disease, stress that can result from overcrowding, predation, which looks into the relationships between predator and prey, or the hunters and the hunted, and herbivora, or herbivory. And it's important to note that these density-dependent factors won't strongly affect small or scattered populations nearly as much, right? So again, as population density increases, so does the effect of the limiting factors that we've identified here on this screen. And as density decreases, the effect of these factors is going to decrease as well. And so the term competition is probably not new to anyone, but whenever we look at it as a limiting factor, competition is basically going to say that as more individuals use a space, we will use up the resources within that space sooner. And so when populations become crowded, individuals might have to then compete for food, water, space, sunlight if you're a plant, shelter, mating opportunities, territory, the list goes on and on. The environment that these populations exist in have finite resources, right? So these finite necessities that living beings require. And if populations become overcrowded, then there won't be enough of those things to go around. And so we might have to then begin to compete for those limited resources. And so there are a couple questions that I can ask. I could say, how can competition affect the birth rate of a population? So one thing that I might say is, well, if I am having to compete to survive, compete for the resources I need just to survive, well, then survival rate might decrease. I might not have as much time to reproduce if all I'm worried about is just basic survival. And so competition going up would probably mean that the birth rate goes down for a certain population. How can competition affect the death rate? Yeah, if I'm trying to compete all the time for the basic necessities to survive, I probably will see an increase in death rate, or the number of individuals that don't end up surviving, as we have to compete more for those limited resources. And then finally, I could ask, how can competition affect the rates of immigration, things coming into an area, or immigration, things exiting an area? Well, if there's always high competition within an area, that might not be the place where I want to set up shop and try to survive, try to meet all my needs. So high competition is probably going to lead to higher rates of immigration, or organisms exiting an area to look for areas that are less dense and therefore have less competition. And if areas have less competition, I could expect to see more organisms probably immigrating into those spaces because there's less competition for resources that I need to survive. We can look at parasitism and disease. These are other factors that depend on how dense a population is. Parasites and diseases are able to spread quickly when populations are more dense and there's more readily available hosts for those parasites to live on. So the denser the host population gets, the more easily parasites would be able to spread from one host to another. In this image down here, you can see a population of ticks. These ticks are parasites living on a dog's ear. Now, if that dog is treated effectively and isolated from other dogs, it's very unlikely that these ticks are going to be able to move from one host to another. And so therefore, the parasites would have a harder time surviving and reproducing. But if this dog is one of, let's say, a dozen dogs that live in very small, in a small area, well, then it would be a lot easier with that higher population density for these parasites to move from one host to another. And so that's something that we might want to consider. There's also stress from overcrowding that can lead to higher competition, less availability for resources, and this can lead to, like we just discussed in the previous slide, lower birth rates, right, where we're surviving, not able to reproduce as much, so lower birth rates, less individuals will survive, so higher death rates, and higher immigration rates, where we're moving out of the area in order to look for better environments with more available resources. And it's important to note that too much fighting can actually cause stress, and that stress weakens the body's ability to resist disease. So as populations become more dense and overcrowded, this can actually weaken the body's ability to fight off disease. And the next density-dependent limiting factor is all about predation, or the predator-prey relationships within environments. Now, this graph is a very, very important graph in this conversation. And so I want to make sure that I identify some really key parts to this so that we can understand what's happening. So whenever I look at this graph, here on the left side, you can see we're identifying the number of wolves. And on the right side, we're tracking the number of moose. So these are two different populations, two different species that are existing within the same environment at the same time, right? So we're tracking from around 1957 to around 2000 and looks like about 2007. So looking at about a 50-year span here, and it's important to know that wolves, in this case, are the predators and moose are the prey. So wolves hunt moose. Now, I can ask a question. What are some general trends that are shown in the graph? So one thing that you might notice, specifically if you look at around, let's say right here, around 1974, at this point in time, you're going to see one really important trend where as one population increases, the other population is decreasing. Okay, and you're going to see that in several spots throughout this graph, where as one population is going up, the other population is going down. So if we use this first example, as we have more wolves, more predators in an environment, they are going to be preying on the moose, and so therefore more moose will be hunted and killed. And so naturally, we're going to expect to see a decrease in moose population as more wolves are successfully hunting and surviving. But it's important to understand that it's not just that the moose population follows the wolf population, because as the moose population goes down, what you're also going to see is that there are less moose available for the wolves, and so there would be increased competition for wolves. Increased competition for food sources for the wolves, and so increased competition is going to lead to, again, lower birth rates, higher death rates, and immigration to other areas. And so we would expect not just for the wolves to influence the moose, but for the moose to influence the wolves. A next question would be, what effect did the canine parvovirus here in 1980, what effect did that actually have on the moose population? So we see a very obvious example where at the onset of CPV, we have a very drastic decline in the population of wolves. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because the virus infects the wolves die from that disease. But what we can actually look at is once we have that really sharp decline in wolf population ending at around 1982, so many wolves have died that the predators for the moose are very few at this point. And so we can see in response in the years to come, whenever there are far less wolves in this environment, well, less wolves means less moose are being hunted. And so moose are able to survive and reproduce more effectively. And we see a respondent sharp increase in the moose population from around, looks like 1983 all the way till like 1996. Okay, so a sharp decrease in wolf population led to a sharp increase in moose population. So the canine parvovirus actually ended up helping the moose population in the years to come. And then final question here is, what might explain the 2020, that should actually say 2000, this does not go to 2020, but to the 2000 spike in wolf population, right? So we're looking at this spike here, where we had an influx in the wolf population. Well, to understand why an increase would happen, again, I would have to look back, right? Because this is always going to be a response to what came before it. So an increase in wolf population, if I look back, this is following a spike in the moose population. So we saw here in 1996, the moose population was at an all-time high. Now, the environment couldn't sustain that moose population for very long. I imagine there was a lot of overcrowding, probably competition for limited plant resources. And so that moose population was so abundant that the wolves that existed at the time probably had a very, very easy time finding their food source, right? So hunting was probably good for the wolves in those years. And because survival was easier, reproduction was easier as well. And so in response to this spike in moose population, we are going to see a spike in wolf population. And so the key thing to take away from this, we're going to work with this graph and other similar graphs that show this in this unit, but the key thing to take from this is that there's an ongoing interplay between predator and prey, and it goes back and forth. And just like there is a cycling up and down of predator and prey, we also see populations of herbivores and plants cycle up and down, right? Herbivores are sort of like the predators to the plants, even though the plants can't move, right? So it's kind of the same thing, just different food sources, right? And different consumers. So I could ask a couple more questions. If moose populations were to get very large, and again, they eat exclusively plants, if the moose populations become very large, what would happen to the wolf populations? Okay, so we saw this in the previous slide, where as more moose are available to be hunted, wolves have an easier time surviving and reproducing. What would happen to plant populations? Well, more moose eating more plants would probably directly lead to a decrease in the plant populations. And so I could also ask a follow-up question. If the plant populations then decrease due to those large moose populations, what would ultimately happen to the wolf populations? Okay, so take some stepwise thinking there. So plant populations go down. Moose populations have to then compete for limited plant resources, so increased competition. There could be a lot of moose that don't have enough food to survive. So increased death rate, decreased birth rate, moose populations go down. And then for the wolves, we now have less moose in our environment to hunt. And so maybe now we have our own increase in competition for food. Death rate goes up, birth rate goes down, and it's an ongoing balance between all of the different the predators, the prey, and their food sources that exist within this environment. And finally, we're going to look at, we've been talking a lot about the limiting factors that exist within an environment that depend on the density of the populations. But there are also a lot of factors that don't depend at all on how dense a population is. They're just going to have the effect that they have, whether there's 1 or 1,000 of a given species within that space. And so density independent factors affect all populations regardless of their size and how dense they are. Density independent factors could include natural disasters like wildfires, and also unusual weather like hurricanes, droughts, or floods. Natural disasters and unusual weather conditions don't stop to ask questions. A wildfire isn't going to check with how dense the forest population is, right? How many rabbits and how many trees. A wildfire is just simply going to spread throughout an area until that wildfire is put out. And then unusual weather. If a hurricane or a flood hits an area, if a drought strikes an area, it's not going to have an effect that depends on how many organisms exist there. It's just going to affect the entire environment independently of how crowded it is. And so if the population density happens to be high, it still would affect more organisms. But the effects of these factors, like the hurricanes, the wildfires, they don't depend on those populations. that are within the environment. So that's the important distinguisher. Things that we've discussed so far, like competition and predator prey and disease, those things, as density increases, so does the effect that those factors can have. But these density independent factors are going to have the same effect regardless. Okay, so that's the really important difference. So it's also important to note that in response to such factors, like let's say a wildfire, this can cause populations to crash. And after a crash, a population could build back up, and it could happen quickly if the environment is still suitable for them in terms of their resources. But it could also stay low for some time. So it could completely remove a lot of the sustenance that these populations need to survive and reproduce. And it's important also to understand that if carrying capacity happens to fall low enough, or the effect of these density independent limiting factors is large enough, populations can be completely wiped out, leading to species extinction, right? One natural disaster that is a really famous example is with the dinosaurs going extinct, right? Whenever a meteor strikes the Earth, right? That was a density independent limiting factor. It didn't stop to ask how many dinosaurs existed one place or the other. It just simply struck our planet and made the conditions of those environments uninhabitable for sustaining dinosaur populations. And so therefore, dinosaur populations did go extinct. So to summarize, I would go back and just review those initial learning objectives, make sure that we can identify what we're talking about with limiting factors, and understand the difference between the limiting factors that are density dependent and independent, even up to the point that those independent limiting factors could result in extinction of populations. And so that is our lesson for the day, and I hope this information was helpful.